Welcome back to Sociology 227. This is Maria Gabrielle Swora, Video 1. In this video, I'm going to introduce you to the sociology of religion. I'll do so by introducing you to the big three sociologists, Marx, Durkheim, and Weber, and outlining their thoughts on religion. This will get you ready to do the readings. Let's get started. I want to get Karl Marx out of the way first. For Marx, religion serves two major purposes. First, it serves to convince people that they should keep participating in labor alienation in ways they otherwise wouldn't. So this is why I've written Religion as Ideology up on the PowerPoint. Here, for Marx, religious feeling is only the outcome of the material base, an ideological lens which we fail to apply to the world correctly. So, it isn't that religion isn't important at all, it is just one of the many cultural structures that obscure us from the basis of production. Secondly, though some Marxists might want to take objection to this, I think religious theorizing also serves as the basis of some Marxist thought, particularly in the work of Ludwig Feuerbach, on whom Marx wrote his famous theses. Feuerbach's book on the essence of Christianity was a development of the work of Hegel, who Marx tried to invert, looking to the material conditions rather than ideal ones. I think we can say that religion served as the inspiration for a lot of the philosophical work that Marx read and tried to invert. In this sense, religion and spirituality forms an important component in the cultural sphere, and some of the inspiration for Marx's early work. Of course, Marxists would dispute that this has any causal efficacy, causing things, because they see culture as a consequence of the materialist operators of history. Durkheim is going to take this line of thought elsewhere, but I'm getting ahead of myself. In terms of political regimes that applied Marxist thought, though, religion was at most tolerated, but most often outlawed. I had a class in my undergrad with a woman who grew up in what was then Yugoslavia. She mentioned that every December 25th they celebrated her grandmother's birthday, in quotation marks. Again, most often outlawed. In sum, then, Marxists treat religion as an ideological structure, either derivative of or obscuring material relationships. Not that all who follow Marx take this approach, but the point is that religion is something to be explained away, rather than a prime mover in the materialist conception of history. Religion is ideological. So for Marx, religion is primarily a problem, something to be explained. It is explained, ultimately, by its relationship to the forces of production. It distracts us. This will be a very different account than the one we get from Max Weber, who I'll look to next. Max Weber's primary goal was to come up with an interpretive structure for social action, be it in the economic sphere, at work in the halls of bureaucracy, or in the religious sphere. For Weber, religion serves as an excellent site of sociological analysis. We can ask positive questions about religion, such as, how do particular churches organize themselves bureaucratically? How do we invest particular historical figures with particular forms of significance? And how do we give authority to those who are seen as following a sacred path? Finally, and this is the subject of the book I talked about last term, what is the relationship between Weber's rationalization thesis and the history of religion? That would be the Protestant ethic in the spirit of capitalism, if you recall. Here Weber turns to the history of Protestant Christianity. Here is a summary. For the longest time, individuals were trying to map their own purity, to record how their own earthly works could serve the divine Creator. This was the case in John Calvin's time, and it is the case in ours. Though the explicit and stated outcome of these spiritual practices have changed throughout history, we can say that the Protestant work ethic emerged in a particular historical condition in the West. The story, and again here I'm summarizing, is that a deep inner loneliness emerged alongside the idea that every man could be his own priest. This is Luther, by the way. To pursue earthly works was okay, so long as they honored the Lord. What had come to be commonplace sayings by someone like Benjamin Franklin, time is money, and so on, came up through this long story of Protestant sects. Industriousness was linked to purity and shaped the mindset which would come to dominate the world, what Weber calls rationalization. That's a summary. You should probably read it yourself. You won't, but you should. In general, then, the Weberian focus on religion asks how it takes a cultural form and how these cultural forms come to shape individual, instrumental rationality. Weber's sociological goal is to explain why particular people took X, Y, or Z form of action through those impacts on their mindset. Recall all that stuff about ideal types that most of you wrote your papers about? This is coming up with an interpretive science of the ways that mental structures emerge historically and shape individual action in religion. Thus, we have a significant contrast with the approach taken by Karl Marx. For Weber, religion does have causal force insofar as it impacts the choices we make. The point here is not everything can be explained by material life. Rather, that ideas about how we ought to live have as much causal force as the material ways in which we exist. Part of religious life is about coming up with understandings of how we ought to live, and thus religion is a key space of sociological inquiry. Weber would spend a lot of time on various religions, but the emphasis remains on an understanding of the ways that collective life shapes individual action. This is crucial. The focus remains on understanding and instrumental rationalities, the reasons why we do stuff. These are the ways in which Weber seeks to understand religion, through his interpretive sociology of social action. Not doctrine itself, mind you, but how we come to involve that doctrine in action. Finally, and my favorite, Durkheim. To talk about Durkheim's masterpiece, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, I should review Durkheim's Sociology and Sociology of Knowledge, or epistemology. Epistemology is a big, pretentious word used to talk about the theory and structure of knowledge. Remember that Durkheim's principal unit of sociological analysis is the social fact. Treat social facts as things. The social is a realm constituted by these things, which exist outside of our will and which restrict our behavior. Recall, I gave the example of the law and of which side the road we drive on. If you try to contravene either, you're gonna have a bad time. Treat social facts as things. Durkheim argues that social solidarity is a social fact, and that all societies, if they're going to be societies, have a level of social solidarity. Durkheim gives us two main types, mechanical and organic solidarity. Mechanical solidarity refers to solidarity by sameness. In lesser developed societies, members are shaped almost uniformly. In societies that have highly differentiated tasks, we find organic solidarity and the emergence of individuals. Society produces individuals rather than the other way around. The kind of people it produces and how different they are based on collective morality. This is where religion comes in, as a way to bind people together. Society produces individuals. Back to knowledge. Here we can read Durkheim's Sociology of Knowledge. We know and act on things as they come up in this moral system. The way that we think about and act on the world is in part constituted by the way the social organism is shaped, by the collective consciousness. Religious knowledge is just like knowledge of any other form, a set of shared sentiments. Sociology and Islam are just two different ways of interpreting the world. In The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, Durkheim argues that all societies, this is important, all societies have some spiritual aspect to them. For Durkheim, religion isn't characterized in terms of having particular gods. There are plenty of religions without them. Nor is it in terms of particular religious codes. No, Durkheim argues that the basis of all religious life is the sacred and the profane. That is the division between that which we imbue with special spiritual power, an idol, a god, a word, and the profane, that which does not have spiritual power, or that which isn't religious. He argues that all societies have these things if they're going to be societies at all. In that book, Durkheim's analysis takes place by looking at the anthropologies of religious practices in tribal Australia. He suggests that in idol worship, these societies have religion in the same way that European states do. This is a radical claim. Durkheim is arguing that though the social structures he is examining are more simple, quotation marks, or primitive, more quotation marks, than our own, the exact same structures exist in relation to the sacred and the profane. We have sacred things to which we have moral attachments and particular forms of knowledge, as did the Australian tribes that anthropologists looked at. In both cases, religion is an essential and permanent fact. Get it? All societies divide sacred from non-sacred stuff. This is a form of knowledge. So too is science. You can probably see where this is going. In dividing the world into the sacred and the profane, Durkheim says that societies will seek to explore the nature of the sacred and develop a form of knowledge about it. In this form of knowledge, we develop specializations, terminology, concepts, practices, just like we would in scientific life. In this sense, in coming up with collectively distributed categories for our meaningful immersion in the world, scientific knowledge takes shape within religion. This, too, is a radical claim, that science and religion are not antithetical, they are not opposed, but are rather one and the same. This is the argument that Marxists would reject. For them, science and religion are opposed. For Durkheim, scientific categories emerged out of religion. Both are fundamentally connected and fundamentally moral. What matters for you people is this. Religion shapes social practices in all societies. It is not primitive. It is an essential part of human life. It is not about creating gods, but rather the religious is the division of the sacred from the not sacred. This is the part of the lecture where I summarize what I've said. First, look to practice. Religion is analyzed insofar as it shapes human practices. In Marx, Durkheim, and Weber, we should study religion because of how it shapes or represents the social organism. Even Marx, for whom we know religion was something to be explained away, we still look on religion because of its relationship to laboring practices, to social production. For Weber, religion is able to be studied sociologically because it impacts the instrumental rationalities that particular actors take into consideration when doing stuff. In Durkheim, the way we define the sacred and act toward it in ways we do not act toward the profane is a form of social action, as it is impacted by social facts. In each of these cases, we move away from a simple religious text and instead to its impact on collective life. Next, the genesis of individualism. In each case, the individual is constituted through particular religious practices. In Marx, this comes up in particular classes or castes in a particular society. A priestly aristocracy or the divine right of kings is an economic consequence, one that shapes particular classes of individualism. Again, for Weber, the way that people come to think and act of themselves as individuals, say in the history of Protestant Christianity, also has a collective genesis. While his method calls for us to look at historically situated individuals, how people come to understand themselves as individuals is the point at hand. People before Luther didn't believe they were capable of interpreting religious doctrine to be autonomous spiritual agents, at least in the Christian world. And, finally, Durkheim. He is arguing that the way societies become more complex relates to the religious forms that operate in them, as social order. Here, individualism is a consequence of the collective consciousness. Just as we sort out the world in collectively organized categories, we also shape individuals according to the moral attachments that pervade the social organism. Individuals, religious, laboring, or otherwise, are a social product. And finally, my students, the focus on meaning. We aren't seeking to assess whether a particular way of understanding corresponds to reality. If people treat religion as real and it impacts their practices, or if people discount religion as not real and it impacts their practices, then we can study it sociologically. The point is that we can follow people who possess a particular understanding of the sacred regardless. What matters is not ultimate truth, but how we orient ourselves to particular understandings of religious truth. That's it for me. See you on the other side of the readings.